The city of Babylon, once a smoldering ruin, now stood rebuilt, its walls towering against the horizon like the stern guardians of an ancient and proud civilization. The streets, though still bearing scars from the battles that had raged within and beyond its walls, bustled with the return of life, merchants hawking their wares, children playing in the alleys, and the scent of fresh bread wafting through the air. Yet, even amidst this renewal, a sense of unease lingered, a shadow that stretched over the hearts of the people who had survived the cataclysm of war. In the heart of this city, atop the walls that had been reforged under his command, stood Ira. The wind that swept over the plains carried with it the memory of battle, but to Ira, it was only a whisper, a distant echo that no longer chilled him as it once did. He stood alone, the sword resting in its scabbard at his side, his gaze fixed on the farthest reaches of the horizon where the land met the sky in a blur of pale gold and gray. The cold that had once gripped Ira, that had seeped into his bones and haunted his every breath, had begun to lose its power over him. It was not that the cold had disappeared, it was still there, an ever-present part of him, but his body had adapted, his very being had adjusted to its icy touch. The chill that had once been a constant source of pain and weariness was now simply a part of who he was, a facet of his existence that no longer dominated his thoughts. In its place, Ira felt something else begin to stir, a warmth that grew from within, subtle and slow, like the first rays of dawn creeping over the horizon. It was a warmth that did not melt the ice in his veins, but rather coexisted with it, a balance between fire and frost that brought with it a sense of peace he had not known for a long time. With this warmth came something else, compassion, a deep and abiding empathy that softened the edges of his once hardened heart. Ira had not expected this change, had not sought it out, but as it took root within him, he welcomed it. The rage that had driven him in battle, the cold fury that had fueled his every strike, began to give way to something gentler, something more measured. He no longer fought with the wild, unbridled ferocity of a man possessed, but with the calm precision of one who understood the true weight of the blade he wielded. The sword, once a tool of raw, destructive power, had become an extension of Ira himself. It was no longer a weapon of indiscriminate death, but a blade of purpose, guided by his will and tempered by the compassion that had begun to grow within him. The cold that radiated from the sword was no longer a wild, untamed force that lashed out at everything around it. Instead, it sought out its targets with unerring accuracy, sparing those who did not deserve its wrath. The growth of compassion. As Ira walked through the streets of Babylon, he could feel the eyes of the people upon him, their gazes filled with a mixture of awe and fear. They knew him as the savior of their city, the warrior who had driven the Persians from their gates and restored their hope. But they also knew him as a figure of coldness, a man whose power was as terrifying as it was awe-inspiring. Yet, as he moved among them, Ira began to notice a change in their expressions, a softening of the fear, a hint of something more, something akin to respect and even trust. Ira had always been distant from the people he had sworn to protect, a shadow that moved in the background, more myth than man. But now, as he felt the warmth growing within him, he found himself drawn to their plight, their struggles, and their joys. He began to listen to their stories, to learn their names, to understand the fears that still haunted them in the quiet moments of the night. And as he did, he felt his own heart opening, the ice that had encased it for so long beginning to crack, allowing the light of compassion to seep in. There was the elderly woman who lived at the edge of the city, her back bent with age, her hands worn from years of labor. She had lost her sons in the war, and her days were spent tending a small garden, the last remnant of the life she had once known. Ira would often visit her, bringing with him small gifts, fresh bread, a warm blanket for the cold nights. At first, she had been wary of him, her eyes filled with the same fear that had marked so many others. But as the days passed, she began to trust him, and in her quiet, trembling voice, she would tell him stories of her youth, of the city as it had been before the war. Then there were the children, those who had been orphaned by the conflict, their eyes wide and haunted by the things they had seen. Ira found himself drawn to them, their laughter and play a balm for the wounds that still lingered in his soul. He would watch them from a distance, his heart aching for the innocence they had lost, and slowly, he began to join them, teaching them simple games, showing them how to craft toys from scraps of wood and cloth. Their laughter, pure and untainted, was a sound that warmed him in a way he had forgotten was possible. And so it was that Ira, the man of cold fire, the warrior who had once known only the fury of battle, began to understand the power of compassion. It was a strength that did not come from the sword or the cold, but from the heart, from the ability to see the pain in others and to offer them solace. It was a power that could heal, that could rebuild what had been broken, that could bring light to the darkest of places. Mastery of the blade. As Ira's compassion grew, so too did his proficiency with the sword. The blade, once an instrument of chaotic destruction, now responded to his every command with a grace and precision that bordered on the supernatural. Ira had always been a skilled swordsman, but now, with the warmth of compassion tempering the cold within him, he found that his movements were no longer driven by rage, but by a calm, focused purpose. When Ira practiced, the air around him shimmered with the cold that radiated from his blade, but it was a controlled cold, directed and purposeful. Each strike was deliberate, each movement calculated. The blade seemed to sing as it cut through the air, the frost that once lashed out wildly now coiling around the sword like a living thing, ready to strike at Ira's command. No longer did the cold spread indiscriminately, freezing everything in its path. Instead, it sought out specific targets, guided by Ira's will. He could direct the frost with a thought, sending it snaking through the air to encase a distant object in ice or to create a barrier of cold that could stop an enemy in their tracks. The power of the blade had not diminished, it had simply been refined, honed to a razor's edge by Ira's growing mastery. The people of Babylon, who had once feared the cold that followed Ira wherever he went, now began to see it as a symbol of protection. The frost that clung to the walls of the city was no longer a harbinger of death, but a shield against those who would seek to do them harm. The cold that had once isolated Ira from the world was now a part of him, a tool that he wielded with the precision of a master craftsman. In battle, Ira's movements were fluid, almost effortless. He no longer relied on brute strength or wild swings of his sword. Instead, he danced through the fray with the grace of a predator, each strike measured, each blow decisive. The sword became an extension of his will, a weapon that could bring death with the touch of its blade or spare a life with a flick of the wrist. Ira's newfound mastery was not just of the sword, but of himself. The cold that had once been his tormentor was now his ally, a source of strength that he had learned to harness rather than fear. The warmth that had grown within him had not melted the ice in his veins, but had balanced it, creating a harmony between fire and frost that made him stronger than ever before. But with this power came a greater responsibility, one that Ira did not take lightly. He had seen the devastation that unchecked power could bring, had felt the cold grip of death in his own soul. Now, as he stood on the walls of Babylon, looking out over the city he had sworn to protect, he knew that his strength was not just for battle, but for the people who lived within those walls, for the lives that depended on him. The whispering cold. The night was deep, and the sky above Babylon was a tapestry of dark clouds, veiling the stars in a shroud of shadow. The city slept, its streets empty and silent, the people secure within the walls that Ira had helped to rebuild. Yet, as the city lay at rest, Ira stood alone on the ramparts, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the blackness of night met the distant line of the earth. The wind howled through the battlements, cold and unrelenting, carrying with it the faint echo of something that had been haunting Ira's thoughts for days now. It was a voice, soft and insistent, that seemed to rise from the depths of his mind, filling the empty spaces between his thoughts with whispers that he could not ignore. This is the Blazefrost Celestial Sword, and this is the Black Iron Horse. These two weapons will help you on your path to justice. The words reverberated in his head, as if the voice had taken up residence in his mind, a constant companion that refused to be silenced. Ira's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of the Blazefrost Celestial Sword, his fingers brushing against the cold, unyielding metal. The sword, now as familiar to him as his own breath, hummed softly at his touch, a resonance that seemed to echo the voice within him. He turned his gaze downward, toward the courtyard where the Black Iron Horse stood tethered, its dark form nearly invisible in the shadows. The horse, like the sword, was more than just a tool. It was a part of him, an extension of his will, a creature born of the same cold fire that burned within his soul. Yet, as he looked at it now, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind, a creeping uncertainty that he could not shake. Why me? Ira whispered to the night, his voice barely audible above the wind. Why was I chosen to wield these weapons? How did I come to possess such destructive power? The questions had been building within him for some time, ever since that fateful day when he had first drawn the sword and felt the cold fire surge through him. At first, he had accepted his role without question, driven by the need to protect Babylon, to defend the weak against the forces that threatened them. But now, as the voice continued to whisper in his mind, the questions became more insistent, more difficult to ignore. What was the purpose of this power? Was it truly meant for justice, as the voice claimed, or was there something darker at work? And if he was meant to protect the weak, then why did the power within him feel so cold, so devoid of the warmth that he had come to associate with compassion and mercy? Ira's grip tightened on the hilt of the sword as these thoughts swirled within him, a storm of doubt and uncertainty that mirrored the tempest brewing in the sky above. He had always been a man of action, a warrior who fought with purpose and resolve. But now, as the questions continued to plague him, he found himself adrift, unsure of the path he was meant to follow. The weight of power. Ira's thoughts turned inward, seeking answers in the depths of his memory, but all he found were fragments, disjointed images that offered no clarity. He remembered the battle with the Persians, the cold fury that had driven him to cut down his enemies without mercy. He remembered the way the frost had spread from the Blaze Frost celestial sword, freezing the very air around him, turning the battlefield into a frozen wasteland. And he remembered the voice, always the voice, whispering to him in the moments of stillness, urging him to continue, to fight, to wield the power that had been given to him. But the voice offered no answers to the questions that now tormented him. It spoke only of justice, of the path he must walk, but never of the reasons why. Why had he been chosen? What had led him to this moment, to this role as protector and wielder of a power that both terrified and awed him? Ira had always believed that he was born to protect the weak, to stand as a bulwark against the darkness that threatened to consume the world. But now, as he stood alone on the walls of Babylon, he began to wonder if there was more to it than that. Was he merely a tool, a weapon to be used by forces beyond his understanding? And if so, what did that make him, a man, or something else entirely? The questions gnawed at him, each one more troubling than the last. He thought of the power that flowed through the Blaze Frost celestial sword, a power that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying in its intensity. It was a power that had saved him, that had allowed him to drive back the Persians and protect the people of Babylon. But it was also a power that had consumed him, that had driven him to the brink of madness, filling his mind with cold fury and a desire for destruction. Ira had learned to control the power, to temper it with the warmth of compassion and mercy. But even as he did so, the questions remained. What was this power? Where had it come from? And why had it been given to him? The nature of the sword. Ira unsheathed the Blaze Frost celestial sword, holding it up to the light of the moon. The blade glinted with a cold, ethereal light, the frost that clung to it shimmering like a layer of crystalline snow. He stared at the sword, at the intricate patterns that seemed to dance along its surface, patterns that he had never fully understood. The sword was beautiful, a work of art as much as a weapon, but it was also a thing of terrible power. It had the ability to freeze, to kill, to destroy with a single stroke. And yet, in Ira's hands, it had also become a tool of protection, a shield against the darkness that sought to consume the world. But as Ira gazed at the sword, he couldn't help but feel that there was more to it than met the eye. The voice in his head spoke of justice, but justice was a concept fraught with complexities, with shades of gray that did not fit neatly into the cold absolutes that the sword seemed to represent. Was it truly justice to wield such power, to decide who lived and who died with a single swing of the blade? And then there was the question of the sword's origin. Who had forged it? And for what purpose? The sword was no ordinary weapon. It was something ancient, something that carried within it a power that defied understanding. Ira had never questioned its origins before, but now, as the doubts continued to plague him, he found himself wondering if the sword had a history that he was not privy to, a history that might hold the answers to the questions that haunted him. He ran his fingers along the blade, feeling the coldness that radiated from it, a coldness that was both familiar and alien. The sword had become a part of him, but it was also a mystery, a riddle that he had yet to solve. The voice of the Black Iron Horse. Ira's gaze drifted down to the Black Iron Horse, the other half of the power that had been bestowed upon him. The horse was more than just a steed. It was a creature of the same cold fire that had forged the Blazefrost celestial sword, a being that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of life and death. The horse had been with him through every battle, carrying him into the heart of the fray with a speed and strength that defied explanation. It was as much a weapon as the sword, a force of nature that had trampled the enemies of Babylon beneath its hooves. But like the sword, the horse was also a mystery, a creature that seemed to embody the same cold, otherworldly power that had become Ira's constant companion. As Ira looked at the Black Iron Horse, he felt a connection to it, a bond that went beyond the ordinary relationship between man and beast. The horse was a part of him, just as the sword was, a reflection of the power that had been given to him. But it was also a reminder of the questions that still lingered in his mind, questions that refused to be answered. Why me? Ira whispered again, his voice barely more than a breath. Why was I chosen to wield these weapons? What is the purpose of this power? The Black Iron Horse shifted in the shadows, its eyes glowing with a faint, eerie light. It seemed to regard Ira with an understanding that was almost human, as if it too shared the doubts and uncertainties that plagued him. But the horse, like the sword, offered no answers, only the silent companionship that had always been its gift. Ira sighed, the weight of the unanswered questions heavy on his heart. He had always believed in his purpose, in the role he had been given as protector of the weak. But now, as the voice in his head continued to whisper, he found himself questioning everything he had once taken for granted. The burden of destiny. Ira sheathed the Blazefrost celestial sword and turned away from the battlements, the cold wind tugging at his cloak as he descended the stone steps to the courtyard below. The questions followed him, persistent as shadows, clinging to the edges of his thoughts. He had always been a man of action, a warrior who lived by the sword and the strength of his convictions. But now, as the doubts continued to gnaw at him, he found himself at a crossroads, uncertain of the path that lay ahead. The voice in his head spoke of justice, of the need to protect the weak and defend the innocent. But what was justice, really? Was it as simple as cutting down those who threatened the peace, or was there more to it than that? And if so, what role did he play in that larger, more complex understanding of justice? The power that had been given to him was immense, but with it came a responsibility that weighed heavily on his shoulders. He had the ability to change the course of events, to decide the fates of those who crossed his path. But was that truly his role? And if it was, then who had given him that power, and for what purpose? Ira's thoughts were a maelstrom of uncertainty, a storm of doubts and questions that had no easy answers. He had been chosen, of that, he was certain, but chosen for what? To be a protector, a warrior, a judge? Or was there something more at play, something that he had yet to understand? As he walked through the courtyard, the Black Iron Horse followed him, its hooves clattering softly on the stone. The horse, like the sword, was a constant reminder of the power that had been bestowed upon him, a power that he still struggled to comprehend. He had saved Babylon, had driven back the forces that sought to destroy it. But at what cost? The power that had allowed him to do so was not without its price, and Ira could feel that price weighing on him, a burden that he could not shake. The voice in his head whispered still, urging him to continue on the path of justice, to wield the power he had been given in the service of the weak and the innocent. But the doubts remained, the questions that refused to be silenced. Why him? Why this power? And what was the true purpose of the path he was walking? The road ahead. As the dawn began to break, the first light of day creeping over the horizon, Ira found himself standing at the edge of the city, looking out over the vast expanse of the steppe. The wind had died down, and the air was cold and still, the silence broken only by the distant cry of a bird soaring high above. The question still weighed heavily on his mind, but as he stood there, watching the sun rise, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. The doubts, the uncertainties, they were still there. but they no longer consumed him as they had before. He had come to understand that the answers he sought might never be fully revealed to him, that the path he walked was one that would always be shrouded in mystery. But he also understood that the power he had been given was not something to be feared, but something to be wielded with care and wisdom. The Blazefrost celestial sword, the Black Iron Horse, they were tools, yes, but they were also symbols, embodiments of the duality that existed within him. Fire and ice, destruction and protection, death and life, they were all part of the same whole, a balance that he had to maintain. Ira knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that there would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face. But he also knew that he was not alone. The voice in his head, the power within him, they were guides, not masters. It was up to him to decide how to wield that power, how to walk the path that had been laid before him. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its light over the city of Babylon, Ira turned away from the horizon and began to walk back toward the city. The questions still lingered, but they no longer weighed him down. He had accepted that some things were beyond his understanding, that the power he wielded was both a gift and a burden. And as he walked, the Blazefrost celestial sword at his side, the Black Iron Horse following close behind, Ira felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He would continue to protect the weak, to defend the innocent, to fight for justice, whatever that might mean. The path was uncertain, the answers unclear, but Ira knew that he had been given this power for a reason. And whatever that reason was, he would face it with the same courage and determination that had brought him this far. For now, that was enough.